Hello, I'm Fabio. I'm a QA manager, and welcome to the Clever Tester. So, today I'm going to talk to you about how you can leverage AI into your software quality assurance process. We're going to cover the second part of the overall idea that I'm demonstrating to you. So, make sure you follow the link on the description in case you want more details about this, because in the first video we covered the basics and showed how you can work with it from a manual perspective. You can run these AI pipelines that I will be suggesting here manually using ChatGPT. Today, the topic of the video is to run this in an automated fashion. So we would just use an agent to interact with and to obtain the response very straightforward without having to switch context. So let's dig into it. So I'm going to start by making this analogy that I think will help to make the whole idea clear to everyone. Imagine you are in your refinement session where a PO or someone from your team has just come up with a user story of a feature that the team needs to develop. So you're going to do something that we call usually refinement, in which case you involve all the team, the whole team, like developers, QAs, product, and other technical people necessary to fully understand the story. And you're going to start just to get more clarity about the business rules that this story needs to deliver. So you're capturing the acceptance criteria of your user story, right? That's a normal process. Imagine that at this point, there is this guy who joins the refinement and he's the AI agent. This AI agent is very knowledgeable. He has fully understanding of your business description, your business rules, how your product should behave. And also he has all the technical background because it has studied the documentation of your product, right? So it's a very knowledgeable guy that joins the room. It will be able to produce very well structured outputs, such as acceptance criteria using example mapping technique. That's going to be very helpful to come back later and understand what was explained during this refinement, what was discussed about this specific item. It also can point to you everything that you need to update in your documentation to make sure it keeps growing as your software also evolves. It knows how to write the testing scenario using Gherkin and using a BDD approach. Gherkin is what's gonna give some structure to what is discussed in terms of testing, so it can output testing scenarios very efficiently. It also has the ability to judge the quality of its work, so it can look at what he's suggesting himself and give you an evaluation about that. So you can also have it clear if the acceptance criteria produced, for instance, is really effective, if it's accurate. But the whole point in here is that this agent is different from any other agent because it has contextually rich information. So we are going to take a look at how we do that. I already mentioned in the first video that you can use a RAG system to provide all this information about your product in terms of technology. This agent also has very good understanding of your past acceptance criteria. So it uses what your team has done before as a reference to kind of collaborate with the next user story that he has to work with. So now let's take a look in this AI agent pipeline. All the abilities of this super agent, let's say, they were split into various other agents. One that's gonna give you the acceptance criteria, the other one that can evaluate the quality of this work, other agents that can produce testing scenarios out of those acceptance criteria, and finally also an agent that's gonna tell you what your documentation needs as updates to keep following the product improvements that you are delivering this new feature, right? So basically, like I said, the first one helps you create an acceptance criteria. It generates in BDD style, uses example mapping technique, well-structured acceptance criteria output, and then you can call the judge. This is not a mandatory part of this process because this agent already knows how to provide really good acceptance criteria, but in case you want to make sure that you have a second agent to judge the first agent work, which we call LLM as a judge, you can use it in this pipeline. So you have this feedback loop from the judge and refining the acceptance criteria again. So you can iterate over until your acceptance criteria reaches out the highest scores in your metrics about acceptance criteria, whatever metrics you define. And then you can pass the approved acceptance criteria to the doc cohesion assistant. That's going to tell you what your documentation needs to be updated with the new user story that your team is implemented with this new feature, right? If you take a look at here, you have an acceptance criteria feedback loop, an entire feedback loop, in which means you can keep iterating over these assistants until the result is what you want. So until you have make sure that it fills all the boxes, let's say. And finally, you can go and output this acceptance criteria to your testing scenario agent. So this is the end goal of this pipeline, to produce and output really good testing scenarios based on knowledge about your whole system, about your functional behavior and also technical details. So it's gonna give you testing scenarios for both of the situations. In here, it's just to mention that all the agents, they have access to this RAG system. So it's a vectorized database that allows them to know the context of your product, as I've been mentioning. For the high level view, I think that's it. So now let's just take a look on how my environment is currently configured. So basically, I'm running everything on localhost. So I have the Langflow installed in my machine. I also have the product documentation in local file server available through HTTP that I can show you. So I have, for instance, the error handling document. That's a JSON document that you can see here. I have also the form system, a business description of my system, and so on, etc. So all those files that I introduced you in the first video, they are exposed through my local file server. And I have the RAG system that's able to inject that documentation to the pipeline of agents efficiently. I'm using Gemini 2.5 Pro as my LLM model. And like I said, it can output acceptance criteria, testing scenarios, and updates suggestion for my product. Okay. What the user is gonna actually do is just gonna send the user story to an orchestrator agent that internally can coordinate all these other agents that I mentioned to you. Now I'm gonna show you how you can create this in Langflow. So let's take a look at this first agent that I created. So this is the RAG agent. It basically has access to all your files. In my case, it's the file server that I'm running locally in localhost. It has to do some operations to make sure that this data can be injected in our vectorized database. In case of this setup that I have running here, I'm just injecting also the metadata to the HTTP requests. So I make sure that the latest updated information about my documentation is the one that my whole system is consuming. And basically, this is the RAG part of the system. Now, let's take a look at the acceptance criteria agent. So the acceptance criteria agent is gonna have access to all our message history, and also is gonna be able to access the RAG flow that I just showed you before. So whenever the user inputs a prompt in here, it's gonna first go through that flow and inject all this context to the prompt. So the prompt will then pass forward to the agents that we are running and output the results for the user. In this case, my prompt establishes that this acceptance criteria agent is the one that will, generate acceptance criteria using an example mapping technique, all the structure, everything I define in this prompt component here from Langflow. Now I have the judge. So the judge of the acceptance criteria, it's gonna basically do the same as the acceptance criteria generator agent, with the difference that the intentions will be reflected in the prompt as to judge the quality of acceptance criteria input rather than receiving an user start and producing acceptance criteria itself. So it gets the result from the first agent and analyze to give you a final validation or evaluation of how that performed against the metrics, right? So again, very similar. You have an input from your user. It's gonna go through the rag to obtain the latest updated information. And then the prompt will just call the agent and the agent will send the result back to the user. This is the judge acceptance criteria agent. And then we have the documentation updates agent. This one very similar to the other ones. This is gonna receive the output from the acceptance criteria generator agent and is also gonna find in the rag tool the latest information, inject that all as a context of the prompt, and from the prompt is just gonna call the agent and the agent's gonna output the result to the user. So very similar, but with different purpose, and the main difference resides on the prompt instructions that I've given to this agent. Finally, we have here the test scenario agent, which is pretty similar to the rest of the agents. Again, the user sends an input, it goes through the rag to obtain the latest information, and in the prompt is where I define what I want this agent to behave as. So I'm just asking this agent to provide the functional testing scenarios and also technical scenarios as an output in a Gherkin feature file. And then the agent is processing all this, doing all the work, and then outputting to the user. And now I'm gonna show you how you can orchestrate the entire thing together. So it's via this refinement orchestrator agent that I created here, which uses a agent as the main part of the entire process, and all the rest of the agents that I've shown to you, with the exception of the rag, that's an input of every single one of the other agents. In this case, it's gonna use the rest of the agents as tools. So it basically have to understand which one to call to provide the expected user outcome. Okay, so based on the inputs, you have to deliver to the user that's interact with it. And again, we have a prompt in here that tells these agents to work exactly as that, as an orchestrator that calls every single one of the other agents to give the final answer to the user properly. And it has also access to the message histories to keep sending information back and forth through these agents. Now let's take a look at some of the results that I've obtained from this orchestrator. So I have in here a complete flow that this agent performed to me. So let's see some of the interesting details in here. As you can see, I sent exactly the user story, in this case, nothing else for this agent. And the agent automatically said it's gonna output acceptance criteria, analysis of the quality of these acceptance criteria, the testing scenarios, and a report about the cohesion of your documentation, how you can update the documentation to reflect the changes introduced by this new user story, acceptance criteria, and testing scenarios. So it first outputted really well the acceptance criteria, exactly in the format that I asked it, creating like a question, defining what's the rule of that acceptance criteria, and giving proper examples. Then if we scroll down a little bit more, we can see that there is the evaluation about the acceptance criteria, again, exactly as I asked the agents. So it shows how correct your acceptance criteria is, how testable it is, how clear and how complete, and how it performs against SMART goals of acceptance criteria. That's done for each one of the acceptance criteria items that I've created in the first agent. So it has like several rules, which are the acceptance criteria, right? And all the rules will be validated against this. So we have all 5 out of 5 scores in this case, which is awesome. And then it outputted the testing scenarios. You can see that for the testing scenarios, it didn't have a really good view of it, but I will show you what I've done later. And then there is the documentation cohesion report. Documentation cohesion, again, points out how many elements from your documentation were actually used when you were creating the acceptance criteria and defining them, and how you can add more into your documentation to make sure you keep track of the new introduced business rules or technical details, right? So it's just gonna say, for instance, for this first rule, it relates to this file, it relates to also this file, and these are the parts of the files that are being used. And also it's gonna tell you what's missing. So the missing part of documentation is reflected in here. And in the end, is also gonna suggest you new files that you should create in our documentation because it couldn't find the information somewhere else, or because it's better to create like separated files to reflect these changes rather than just updating our current documentation, right? So now in the end, like I mentioned before, as the testing scenarios are not output in a very nice view, let's say, so I just asked it to format them better before showing up to me. And then it showed to me in a Gherkin syntax in a feature file. That's what we wanted in the end, right? So now it reads a lot better. So it has all the scenarios that I said, and also it has the technical scenarios as well. Now let me show you again. I've sent just the user story to this agent, and it said that it would output again the same items: acceptance criteria, evaluation, the documentation cohesion, and the testing scenarios in the end. But what it did here, if you can see, like all the rules, all the validation of those rules, it's all good, and the documentation adherence of them. But it didn't output the testing scenarios as it said it would in the beginning. So I had to ask twice about the testing scenarios to be output. Sometimes it can happen. So it then said what it would do, and it has redone the entire thing. So it has showed me the acceptance criteria again, the evaluation again, how this performs against the documentation, and then finally it gives to me the Gherkin feature file with my testing scenarios. So this is just to show you that sometimes, because of the agent's capacity, because of these models, or because of my local setup, it doesn't behave exactly as the same every single time. So sometimes it fails to obtain you one or another information or output, but you can, just interact with it as you interact with ChatGPT or any other agents until you get the answers that you want. Now I want to show you how I use this agent also. This would be more straightforward approach. So I just say, give me the acceptance criteria. I know that I don't need to evaluate them every single time. I know the output is quite consistent, and I want just the testing scenarios. I don't want to know about documentation at this point or what I have to do to update them, and etc, etc. So I just asked it straight for acceptance criteria and testing scenarios. Then it outputted to me exactly what I asked, the acceptance criteria like I mentioned, and the testing scenario. So this is also a very short and direct way of interacting with this orchestrator and obtaining the outcome that is interesting for you as well. And finally, the last example that I'm going to show you is an example where I asked for every single one of those outputs, but in phases. So first I asked only for the acceptance criteria, then I asked about the evaluation, then about the documentation cohesion, and then finally I asked about the testing scenarios. So this is also another way that we interact with this agent. It fails sometimes to write. It was just talking to me and asking me which option I would like to take to proceed, and then I made a choice and it didn't do anything for me. So I asked what happens, and then it started just outputting again. So exactly as you can interact with any LLM, and yeah, that's basically the result. And again, it failed to format the testing scenarios. In the end, I asked it to format it better and just format it to me. So we have seen in this screen how I can interact with the agents from the playground chat interface that Langflows provide us, but you can also programmatically interact with it. So in here, you can see how I can interact programmatically with my flow because it exposes an API to interact with the flow that you create. So you just need a bunch of keys, the ID of your flow, and then you can, just write your own application to interact with it. So I've just written this very simple chatbot here interface that you can just ask whatever you want. Like I've input the user story here, and the assistant just outputted to me the complete acceptance criteria for my user store. So yes, you can interact with your flow like that. You can also interact with your flow via Docker containers as well. And also you can export your flow to a JSON file, and you can export your flow as a MCP server and integrate it with any MCP server enabled tool that you prefer. We have finally come to the end of this presentation. So I hope it was clear for you what the proposal was, which is to leverage AI into the very beginning of software quality assurance, because I've seen several approaches like self-healing frameworks, outputting automated code with AI agents, and also doing tests entirely using agents themselves without any code. But I haven't seen much about how you can efficiently, let's say, use an agent since the very beginning. So I just wanted to wrap all my ideas in one approach and just to demonstrate to you. Yeah, so I would just like to thank you for watching, and let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and feel free to connect me in the LinkedIn as well. Bye.